Thank you, Randy, and I'd like to issue a warm welcome to everyone here and also online. Dr. Christy McDonald is Director of Science at Raritan Headwaters Association. She has a PhD in ecology from Rutgers. As a PhD and former academic myself, I'm so impressed that someone as intelligent and talented as Christy is deeply engaged as a public intellectual, working for an organization that is dedicated to preserving and restoring the environment. That's a great model for young people today. We don't all have to be academics. It's great. Together with Eric, and I'm sorry, I didn't, Eric's last name? Kvyat. I should have guessed, but with my name. Together with Eric Kvyat, who similarly is executive director of Hudsonia, a nonprofit institute for scientific research and education based in Annandale, New York, she co-authored this book, Urban Biodiversity, The Natural History of the New Jersey Meadowlands. And I was going to hold it up because I had my copy at home, and then I fell asleep rereading part of it last night, and there it is. It's in my bed. The Meadowlands is both, my cat is probably enjoying it now. The Meadowlands is both an utterly unique place, and it's also a microcosm of the state of New Jersey. Like the Garden State, the Meadowlands is a place of great natural beauty, an immense ecosystem function that has also been degraded to the point that it's known not for the 280 species of birds that use it as a major stop on the Atlantic Flyway, but as the reputed resting place of Jimmy Hoffa and the slow-motion catastrophe of American Dream Mall. But given the book's title of Urban Biodiversity, we really should remember that this is a huge area within the very midst of the densest part of the densest urbanized area in the country. And yet the Meadowlands isn't somehow an obstacle to that, but it's rather part of the rich and diverse. I was a historian, so I can mention history for a second. It's part of a rich and diverse ecosystem that actually gave rise to New York City and northern New Jersey, made this a place that we inhabit now. Next time you're at the Oyster Bar at Grand Central Terminal, think about why they were giving away oysters in the 19th century, and look up the history of oysters in Upper New York Bay. If, like New Jersey, we can't ever restore the Meadowlands to its pristine state without moving to the off-world colonies, still, Christy and Eric's book teaches us it is a place we can learn to coexist with, and we can make it possible for the Meadowlands to play the critical environmental role that it can, protecting the environment as a key buffer and offering an incredible refuge to a huge number of species. Right. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Christy.
Thank you, Kazis. I'm humbled by your introduction. And good morning, everyone. I'm Christy MacDonald. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about this book. I have my copy here, luckily. And I'm also happy to be here to celebrate native plants and learn about native plants with all of you. I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot today together with all the interesting talks that are happening. So I am the Director of Science at Raritan Headwaters, and I'm also a Research Associate at Hudsonia. Eric Kvyat is the Executive Director of Hudsonia, which is, I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. Here's Eric. I wish he was here today with me. He had a pressing event he had to be at, and he couldn't come today. But Eric Kvyat has been a mentor to me for many years. He's a top-notch ecologist, botanist, herpetologist, and overall naturalist. He's the executive director, as we said, of Hudsonia, which is a wonderful organization that's working on trying to help us to better understand local biodiversity so we can then plan to protect it. He's done work for a biodiversity assessment manual in New York City, and also in the Hudson Valley. And this book is a compendium of our work in the New Jersey Meadowlands over about, let's see now, since 1999, so about 23 years, 24 years. So again, about Hudsonia, they're actually based at Bard College Field Station. If anybody would like to reach out to Eric Kvyat, I have his email address here, and his business card is outside, as well as mine. I'm currently the science director at Raritan Headwaters. We're a nonprofit conservation organization. We're based at Fairview Farm Wildlife Preserve in Bedminster, New Jersey. If anybody would like to visit us, we have the most beautiful wild meadows, lots of native species, and it's also a birding hotspot on eBird. Our organization is focused on restoring and protecting land, water, and biodiversity in the Upper Raritan watershed region of New Jersey and beyond, because we do a lot of advocacy work at the state level. And I'm going to be here all day for this. I don't want to miss the talks. And if anybody would like to speak with me, I'll be outside during the breaks. And if you want to learn more, I'd also like to meet you. I've already met some very interesting people here today who have a strong interest in the Meadowlands, and also some people I went to graduate school with who I haven't seen in a very long time. So here is a map of the place we're going to be talking about, the New Jersey Meadowlands. And it's part of the New York City region estuarine delta. I don't have a pointer here, but hopefully it's clear enough to be able to see the slides. You can see the beige kind of rectangular area is the New Jersey Meadowlands. That's actually the Meadowlands Core District that's overseen by the New Jersey Meadowlands Commission. The river that flows through it is the Hackensack River, and it flows south to where it meets up with the Kilvan Cull, where you see that right turn, and then it meets up with Lower New York Bay and the Hudson River. It's a very connected system. And if you even continue to go south, you end up going down into Raritan Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. The oval is actually the area that we included in our book because we considered beyond the political boundary of the Meadowlands that system really should be looked at a little bit more beyond, from the northern edge of the oval, which is Oradell Dam on the Hackensack River, and down to the Newark Bay and Kilvan Cull area. So this is what a lot of you have probably seen. How many of you have been to the Meadowlands? Almost everybody. So have you ever flown into Newark Airport or JFK or LaGuardia? Then you've been to the Meadowlands. You've been over it, at least, hovering over it. And you've seen it. You may not have known you were there. And this is kind of what it looks like, a very complex landscape of green spaces, nature, highways, cutting through natural areas, wetlands, and open water. And in the distance, you can see the cities. You see New York City, you see Jersey City, Bayonne, some of the other areas there. So it's pretty complex. And if you've taken the train to New York City or driven on the New Jersey Turnpike up there, you've seen this as well. Some of you may have even gone hiking in the Meadowlands. And it might at first look like it's just a sea of Phragmites or common reed. And for many years, that's what we thought about of it. We just thought it was not much there. It was kind of a degraded wetland. I'll talk a little more about it, but it's very much something that is the reason this book just came out recently in August, is that we weren't valuing these urban places because we thought they were too degraded and didn't have any biodiversity to be concerned about. And here's a remnant Atlantic white cedar swamp in the Meadowlands. A lot of you have probably seen that. How many of you have actually, in driving through the Meadowlands, seen the Atlantic white cedar stumps that are still there? They were cut down a long time ago, but they're still there, and you can see that things have changed a lot in the Meadowlands. And there's no denying the long use and abuse that's taken place there since colonization, since clearing of the forests, some agricultural activities that took place there, ditching, draining, filling of wetlands, and landfills, industrialization, all the factories. And before the Clean Water Act, a lot of the things coming out of those factories were being dumped right into the rivers. And that includes raw sewage. This resulted in a heavily polluted river and degradation of habitats. The building of the New Jersey Turnpike and some of those other big highways didn't help very much either. But things have changed a lot over time in the Meadowlands. And since the 90s, there have been organizations, maybe even before the 90s, but in the 90s, Hackensack Riverkeeper, New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, some of those organizations started to work to protect the Meadowlands and to try to change our view of them. And also the Clean Water Act had a big impact. Wetland regulations had a big impact because at one time, you could fill wetlands and build on them easily. Now it's a little bit more difficult. But we'll talk about later that wetlands still are in danger. So when we talk about cities, we might say, what biodiversity? This is kind of summarizing what I was just saying. What biodiversity, meaning biodiversity as we normally define it, a lot of us do anyway, unless you're a person who looks at genetics of species and the genetic diversity within species. We often look at it as the number of species, the diversity of species, or genera, or communities, biological communities. And that's what Eric Kiviat and I focus on because that's what makes a lot of sense to most of us. So the attitude was often, and I can even remember as a child driving through the Meadowlands with my family. We would go to East Rutherford from Jersey City to where my grandparents were buried in the cemeteries that overlook the Meadowlands. And the area there was often considered degraded, contaminated, and it was in many areas. Low species richness, urban wetland is a wasteland. Low functioning ecosystems, few ecosystem services that we gain from those places. And Phragmites, or a common reed, is junk. And the wetlands are a source of mosquitoes. So these were just very common biases. And, as in the time when Eric Kiviat and I first met in the mid-90s and started to talk about doing work in the metropolitan area to try to bring attention to urban biodiversity, we both agreed that this common misconception or bias has really helped developers and industry to downgrade the value of these places. And so a lot has changed since then. So the book kind of coincided with urban ecology really blossoming as a field, where there's a whole field of people that now are interested in urban places and trying to look at how people can coexist with nature and we can still have biodiverse cities. Because we know that biodiversity, having green stuff around and organisms, being able to see birds and insects, and just everything that is there when you see these green spaces, is important for human mental and physical health. It's an important issue for environmental justice, in part because of that. Why is it that people in underserved communities should have to be living without access to nature and green spaces? Not to mention the services they provide in giving us clean water. And biodiversity is critical for that. If you don't have functioning forests and rivers and streams in the headwaters of a watershed, you're not going to have very good water quality downstream of that place. Also provides reserves of species. They might be isolated from other areas, and they might be, as we found in the Meadowlands, places where they're not found anywhere else. And some of them are rare, globally rare. Because of the situation of the Meadowlands, it's also important fish nurseries for marine fish, the salt marshes and other wetlands in the Meadowlands. Carbon sequestration, something we need close to home, is a really important ecosystem service, where we have all these, factories and places where we're consuming fuel. We need a place that can take all that carbon in close by. And then just educational opportunities for kids and adults. So some of you have had the opportunity to go out with Hackensack Riverkeeper in the Meadowlands on the river, and it's like you're in a wilderness, and you're literally just 3 miles from New York City. Plus, there's some undiscovered species that are always out there to be found. And wetlands are still under threat, so this is an important thing to consider. Everything isn't protected by regulations. We still find sometimes that wetlands are being filled, especially small pieces. So if you keep chipping away at small pieces of wetlands, not just in the Meadowlands, but everywhere, then you eventually are going to have a big impact on how much wetland area is left. In the Meadowlands, there's a lot of legacy pollutants from industry, from the days when they were dumping things that people couldn't dump now, hopefully. Mercury, PCBs, heavy metals. Also stormwater pollution. This is still a big problem. This is a problem everywhere. Stormwater pollution, where we have a lot of built areas, all that water's got to go somewhere, and it's going to run right off and into our streams and our wetlands, and eventually the ocean. So that's a big source of pollution that we need to address. And we'll get into this later, but the Native Plant Society plays a big role, because by planting native plants on your property and turning lawns into more native plant and wild habitat, you can help capture stormwater. CSOs, combined sewer overflows, where there's big storms, the sewage actually mixes with the stormwater and goes right into the rivers. And sea level rise. These are issues associated with climate change. And these are right there in front of us now. We had Hurricane Sandy, we had Ida. We know that there are big impacts happening that we haven't seen before in New Jersey, or not for a very long time. Also wetland mitigation banks, where you can take a wetland in the Meadowlands, and because they're still considered somewhat degraded and want to increase the habitat value. And I'm not saying I'm against that, but sometimes you're allowed to destroy a wetland somewhere else and invest in trying to restore a wetland that's in the Meadowlands or another place like that that's dominated by Phragmites, and you're going to try to remove the Phragmites and replace that with a totally natural system of salt marsh vegetation. And that allowed the loss of another wetland. So that's actually a loss there if that wetland mitigation is not successful, because it's hard. We don't really fully understand how to recreate something that's taken thousands of years to develop. And then misdirected management. So if you don't know much, if you don't know the biodiversity that's there, you don't know what species are there, you can make some decisions that might actually cause the loss of some biodiversity. So that's why it's really important that we're all out there. Many of you are amateur or professional botanists, and I think that it's extremely important, the work we do, to gather information on what's out there, what biodiversity exists. And we'll talk later about some of the climate mitigation projects, trying to put Band-Aids on the problem of sea level rise and storm surges, instead of addressing things in a more holistic way, trying to use nature to address climate change, moving people out of areas that are going to be impacted by climate change so that we don't have to worry about protecting property and can allow it to return to a natural ecosystem. You can tell I have a lot. I'm a writer, so I talk a lot. I mean, I write a lot, and then it's hard to talk about all of it. I have so much more to say. So why the New Jersey Meadowlands? Well, Eric and I were actually, I was still a grad student, and it was 1999. NRDC and some of the other groups that work in the Meadowlands to protect the area were concerned about another mega mall project. Another crazy name too, Xanadu, okay? Like the Xanadu Mall is gonna save us all. They wanted to fill 200 acres of wetlands that were part of an extensive wetland system. And at the time, the developers were using that whole adage of it's Phragmites, so it's junk, it's polluted, it's an urban wetland, it doesn't, and this is gonna bring economic benefits. And there's always that give and take in the Meadowlands and in other places between trying to preserve an area, restore an area, and the economic pressure. So being that location so close to New York City, Jersey City, of major ports. It's very expensive real estate. So there always is that pressure. So Eric and I were hired to, and it was really Eric hired at that time. I was a grad student and I was working with him, and we worked very hard to try to find information on the New Jersey Meadowlands. There were mostly just reports from consulting firms, the building of the New Jersey Turnpike in the 80s, other big projects, building projects where they had done environmental impact statements and assessments. So we also found some published papers. Rutgers mainly had professors who were working in the Meadowlands on fish, and also monitoring some of the projects for the mitigation banks to see if they were successful. So we spent years, we did some field work, mostly Eric and people from Hudsonia, his staff, were out there doing surveys because there were a lot of things that hadn't even been studied yet. And eventually the mall was prevented. It didn't happen. It was successful. We were able to show there is an incredible biodiversity even when we finished the report. We published a paper in Urban Habitats on biodiversity of the New Jersey Meadowlands. And actually, if you look at that online journal, they have a lot of great resources on the Meadowlands if you're interested, of studies that have been done there now in the last 10, 15 years. But we didn't stop there. Once you get into the Meadowlands, it becomes more and more fascinating. Once you realize what's actually there, it's hard to go away as an ecologist. So there were a lot more work happened, and that culminated in the 445-page book we have here, which includes very, very long lists of the organisms that are in the Meadowlands. We're still working there and trying to build that knowledge. So surveys are still being done, not only by us. The New Jersey Audubon's doing a lot of bird surveys. Eric Kiviat and Hudsonia are leading a study of fungal diversity in the Meadowlands. They've collected, there was almost no information on fungi. So they've collected a lot of samples. Some of them are identified, some are still being identified by experts. And, when we say why the Meadowlands, it's really because we're just fascinated by this place. I think I was as a kid too. I grew up in Jersey City. Eric's from New York City. We have that context of appreciating small spaces of nature in the city. And this isn't a small place, it's actually a big place, the New Jersey Meadowlands. So we hope that we're gonna find out things that we can apply to other urban areas, not just the Meadowlands, and we can get lessons from other urban areas that have been trying to tackle the issue of how to keep biodiversity intact close by, and apply that in the Meadowlands. And this is just to keep the conversation going on urban ecosystems. So urban biogeography, as I said, there's a large literature on biogeography, ecology, species, and how they interact with their environment. And that's kind of the basis of Eric and our book. That bottom list there, so landscape characteristics and habitat quality, that's kind of where the urban ecosystem is a little bit different. We really focus in on those characteristics of urban areas. But species intrinsic characteristic just means that they've evolved most of them before we were here. Some of them are, and they're still evolving, we find. Some species are very able and tolerant to live in urban places. They're pre-adapted. Some are not at all. Most species aren't adapted to trying to cross highways, for instance. Like they just things going 80 miles an hour barreling down the road. They don't have that ability to, know not to do that, not to cross. Cities are in very rich, diverse areas like coastal areas, or areas associated with water. So there's wetlands and water. The New Jersey Meadowlands is in New Jersey, so you've got the marine to mountains environment. There's also large-scale factors like climate the northern and southern climes, and New Jersey's kind of at the intersection of the two. So we have some northern species that are at their southern limit, and we have some southern species that are at their northern limit. And then there's the history, the geologic history and human history. So another thing is we can sort of lump species. It's very hard to do this, but we know that, and we learned more about this by writing the book, by the way, that there's certain characteristics that make species urban tolerant versus urban sensitive. And of course, there's lots of exceptions and a gray area in between. But a lot of urban tolerant species can persist in smaller areas because we know urban ecosystems are very fragmented. Whereas the urban sensitive groups often need the large areas. Urban tolerant might be good dispersers, and so they can return to a place if they were extirpated or there was some event that caused them to be gone. They might be able to get back there and recolonize as soon as there's suitable habitat available. Birds, for instance, they can fly back in. Salamanders, not so much. They can't really walk back into a place that's isolated from their current habitat. Habitat generalists seem to be more urban tolerant. They can adapt easier. They can find what they need in urban areas. And habitat specialists, they would need, some of these rare habitats we find, and that in urban areas are even more rare than they are in more outlying areas. They might have a lower sensitivity to contaminants, salinization, and water quality in general. Whereas the urban sensitive groups might be, unable to tolerate those things, and less affected by hydrological alterations. And then just being tolerant of people walking around. If you're walking through a park and, there's some birds that just kind of hang out and don't mind you being there, they're probably urban tolerant species, but the birds that avoid trails and stay far away from people are the urban sensitive ones. So we had this background to make our predictions for the book, which is there's a rich pool of available species in this region in New Jersey around the Meadowlands. And that we'd find the highest diversity of urban tolerant groups, taxa associated with predominant habitats, like the really dominant habitats, like wetlands, and taxa that are well studied. So that's a big problem. If you've studied them a lot, you find more species. So that's going to make it seem like there are more species. So here's a little bit of an overview of some of the major habitats. I'm going to start out just talking about habitats as really places where organisms live. But I mean, it's defined by the vegetation and the composition of the vegetation and flora of those areas mostly, and the water. But there are some habitats that really dominate. And if you look at this map, oh, well, I didn't realize my cursor was able to be seen. Okay, so all that green, you would think that's forest, but actually it's all wetlands in the Meadowlands. This is an inset of the Meadowlands district. Even the light green and the dark green and the kind of like middle green, that's all wetland area. So that's pretty dominant in the Meadowlands. There's also a lot of river, so that aqua blue color, and open water areas, ponds and reservoirs is that aqua blue color. And then the beige is mostly, but not all, urban. It's the human-built habitats that surround those areas. So those are the dominant habitats in the Meadowlands. You've got wetland fill, landfill cover. There's a lot of landfills that are now abandoned in the Meadowlands. Deep and shallow channels, estuarine marshes, diked or tide-restricted marshes, partly drained hardwood swamp forests, and lots of buildings, towers, roads, and paved areas. Impoundments are very important for biodiversity in the Meadowlands. They include tide-restricted, fresh, and brackish open water habitats. And here we see Kingsland Impoundment. This is one of the places you can actually go in the Meadowlands and take a little walk on their boardwalk around this open water area at DeCourt Park. And you can see the congregating, foraging great egrets there in the summer that breed close by to the Meadowlands. You see salt marsh and mud flats. This includes some areas with planted smooth cordgrass and volunteers such as dwarf spike rush. And in the background, you can see woods on the spoil island and also mudflats, these open areas where shorebirds like to forage. Then there's the urban stormwater infrastructure, and this is the old school type where you've got almost possibly no value there ecologically, but there's a big movement now to try to retrofit these stormwater areas where this is where you've built lots of impervious cover and you need to capture the water somewhere so you don't flood out other properties, and they can be made more functional so that they have native plantings. They allow the water to infiltrate slowly into the ground and be filtered. And we'll talk a little more later if we have time about green infrastructure. Then there's the brownfields. Some of those abandoned factories are quite beautiful when you're driving down the turnpike. You know, they've got all these broken windows and everything, and there's just, you can see all this nature coming back where, you know, it's been inactive for many years. Growing in the cracks in the pavement, and then all around the footprint of the original factory and industrial site. There's a movement to turn those into green fields. So a lot of these sites end up being slated for redevelopment. And in areas in New Jersey, there's a lot of redevelopment, including warehouses are going in. We really hope that those redevelopments are going to stick within the footprint of the original industrial area and leave those areas that are now turning into shrubland and fields and meadows and young forests. And that's called green fields. They potentially could be parks, but they also provide other ecosystem functions in urban areas. This is an example of a green field as well, meadows, shrublands, and grasslands. And you get lots of pollinator species, habitat specialists that need those open habitats. They're also temporary habitats, though. If they're not constantly maintained or new ones aren't created, they're going to go away eventually and be taken over by woody vegetation and eventually turn into forest. Abandoned landfills are another example of green fields where you have vegetation growing on them. Some of them are actively being restored. And if you're driving through the Meadowlands, you can see them from your car or from the train, and you see trees are growing on them now. And then you have built habitats. So that's anything that we built, the people built. The residential developments, varying density, the industrial areas, commercial areas, park areas. They vary greatly in their biodiversity, depending on a lot to do with plants, a lot to do with trees, shrubs. Are there gardens, or is there an herbaceous layer? Is there sources of water? So this is an area that this is where we can make a big difference individually by doing things around our own properties. Here's an example: large trees in urban parks and along streets support bats, birds, butterflies, moths, other species, pollinators when they're flowering. And then these small artificial habitats, even in a city, downtown in the city, can attract biodiversity and water sources, supplemental feeding, those types of things are important. And cemeteries, I think I mentioned I used to go to the cemetery, and I remember my father finding owl pellets under almost all the conifers in the wintertime, these old mature conifer trees that are in cemeteries in that region and around most cities. There's also minor habitats like xeric uplands, Laurel Hill, Little Snake Hill. Some areas are forested, some are not. It's very limited, though. They're not large. There are also mesic uplands, clay pit lakes, streams and riparian areas that are vegetated, and springs. Forests are a big one. Prior to settlement, there were a lot of upland and riparian forests and forested wetlands in the region. A lot of the species, the taxa in our region are adapted to living in forests. And so the regional pool that we compare the Meadowlands to, there was forested habitat there at one time. So forest cover, as we know, has been greatly, declined in the last 60 years or more. And so that's had a big impact on the species in the regional pool, that they just become low in abundance. And the Meadowlands doesn't have a lot of forest, so that's an area where we could work on improving habitat for biodiversity. And then narrow riparian buffer strips along major rivers and streams. We don't really have a lot of wide forests along streams, which is better because then you have areas where you're keeping the riparian area safe from erosion and other things. One of the things, like I said before, we discovered was just that a lot of taxa have not been studied. Here's just a short list, but any taxa can be studied more pretty much in the Meadowlands. We did find some surprises that were fun. Pretty much every time you go out in the field, you'll find some kind of surprise. So river otter in the Meadowlands, yellow-crowned night herons nesting, northern harriers hunting in areas with Phragmites even, and other areas like grasslands, peregrine falcons nesting, clapper rails, Atlantic coast leopard frog. There's several populations. This is a new species that's been described just in the last 10 years, 15 years. Floating marsh pennywort, many spiked flat sedge, Torrey's rush, and several mosses and liverworts that are not found commonly in the area. So I'm going to go over real quick. This book has very detailed information about the taxonomic groups that have been studied. I'm going to give you an overview of what we found. I'm going to talk about the cryptogams first, the fungi, lichens, bryophytes, and pteridophytes, which are the ferns and fern allies. So fungi are in an ongoing study right now because there was almost no information available on them. And we know how important they are, so that was something that we knew we needed to focus on. We know they're important for their symbiotic relationships with plants, and other reasons, but they were very understudied. So the diversity of them is poorly characterized. And we know that, we're not going to find all of them there, but so far what we're finding is there is a not high, but moderately high diversity. The lichens, 58 species have been identified so far. We consider that to be low to moderate diversity when we compare it to the species pool. They're very limited by air quality, salt, contaminants, and a lot of the large and complex species like the beard lichens, reindeer lichens, and rock tripes are actually absent. We found 87 species of mosses, moderate diversity. They tend to be restricted to small patches at the bases of trees or on logs and wetland soil. Freshwater wetlands are important, and they're very limited in the Meadowlands. They're also found on concrete, and they can also be limited by similar things like air quality, low moisture, and heavy metals. Liverworts, extremely low diversity. They're very limited by air quality, water quality, and moisture. And ferns, we found 20 species. That's moderate diversity. And there's moderate urban sensitivity. Some species are able to do very well in urban areas. We think there's a lot of collecting of ferns. So, if you're walking through a natural area and you see a cool fern, you might say, hey, that would look nice in my garden, and get it. That happens with plants a lot, I think. But so that is an issue for not just plants too, but things like reptiles and amphibians collecting. And the fern allies, we found 6 species. Actually, 5 of them have not been found since the early 1900s. So really 1 species was found during this study and it was one of the horsetails Erickiviat located. Now on to the seed plants. There's actually a lot of them there, a lot of diversity. But compared to the pool, there's still some groups are not as diverse as we would like to see them. So 1,065 species so far, and I'm sure every time Eric or some of his folks go out, or some of the botanists we work with, they find more. They vary in urban tolerance, as I said. Some of them are sensitive to air, water, soil quality, and the absence of those symbionts that we talked about. I always love to see swamp rose mallow when we're out. We usually see them out in the Meadowlands, and it's really a fun thing to see. Spring beauty, we see that one of the spring ephemerals in the forests. And up on Laurel Hill, which is the drier xeric conditions, we've found Rhus aromatica, or fragrant sumac. So of those 1,065, 118 are trees, 101 species of shrubs, 39 woody vines, 37 herbaceous vines, and 770 other herbs. About 70% of the species we found are native. So that's good news. 30% are not, 70% are. So the groups such as trees and shrubs, not including the conifers, are somewhat diverse and relatively tolerant of urban conditions. Spring ephemeral wildflowers, not diverse. We find that in a lot of places in New Jersey where there's a high deer population. At one time, the population of deer in the Meadowlands was not very high. So we are starting to see the population increase. And that could have an impact. Collecting could be another issue. Availability of pollinators, and very fragmented forests. So finding propagules for these species is not easy. Conifers are sensitive to air quality, and they're also sensitive to salinization. The true sedges, there is a medium diversity. There's actually a lot of sedge species in the Carex genera, but they are sensitive as well. Grasses, diverse and tolerant. Cord grasses, sensitive to water quality, dieback. Sea level rise, a study has shown that a lot of the Spartina marshes will actually be gone by about 2050 if current sea level rise scenarios take place. And orchids, there's very low diversity. They might be sensitive to fragmentation, lacking those mutualistic fungi, and the specialized pollinators they need. So here are some examples of cordgrass or Spartina species. Here's another thing that we often discovered. If you were just looking at this from far away, you would miss that within the Phragmites, these large patches of Phragmites, you often would have other species still persisting and growing within the Phragmites areas. Here's an example of a remnant blue joint grass and Phragmites area at the Empire Tract and Hackensack Meadowlands. We also found a very large population of cottontail rabbits that loved this site. The true sedges, moderate diversity, as we said. This is just Carex species. And submergent aquatic plants, very, very low diversity. That water quality and salinity are likely having a big impact on them. And the animals, just touching on a few things here. Moderate diversity, sensitivity to hydrology. I'm talking about odonates, which are dragonflies and damselflies. Water quality, salinity, and aquatic substrate. So some of them require fresh water, and there's not a lot of fresh water in the Meadowlands. Some of them like brackish water, so they do fine there. So that's an important limiting factor for them. Bees, we've found 78 species. They're mostly urban tolerant species, somewhat diverse in the Meadowlands. They need to have, areas, large areas with enough plants to provide their nectar and pollen. And here was an interesting find, a globally rare species. It's only known from, I think, 14 locations in the United States. The clam shrimp, Maddox's clam shrimp, it's sensitive to hydropattern and habitat loss. Here's some pictures. It's actually a crustacean inside what looks like to be almost like a bivalve shell, but they actually have legs. And this is a picture of them inside their shell, but then you can see them here swimming around, and you can see their appendages coming out, and they move around in these pools that are actually maintained by people riding dirt bikes in the Meadowlands, kind of on those back roads. And so they like people. They require people to maintain those pools. Land snails, not very many. Many of them are actually introduced species, and they're sensitive to soil structure, chemistry, moisture, fragmentation. Fragmentation is a big issue for terrestrial wildlife. And then fish, moderate diversity, still in need of study, believe it or not. Fish are usually very popular, especially in a wetland and river area, but we still feel there could be more work on fish, but there has been some study. And the marine and estuarine fish in the Meadowlands are much more diverse than the freshwater fish. With the Oradell Dam being upstream, there's limits on the amount of fresh water entering the lower Hackensack River, so the salinity levels are pretty high there. Amphibians, as you would expect, they are a pretty low diversity. They're sensitive to fragmentation, scarcity of natural soils, and the salinity and contaminants have a big impact on them. And reptiles. We don't have a picture of the eastern diamondback terrapin, which is one of my favorite. They are moderate to low diversity. We all know we see turtles crossing the road all the time, and there's a lot of big highways in the Meadowlands, and they like to roam. So there's a lot of mortality of reptiles, including snakes, in the Meadowlands and other places. And then birds, very well studied, I should say. Most of the studies are done in the breeding season, but there have been other studies done outside the breeding season, looking at wintering habitat. A lot of the birds are associated with water. So there's waterfowl, there's long-legged waders, there's shorebirds. A lot of the diversity is them. There's also a lot of passerine birds. There's the perching birds or songbirds. And depending on where you're looking, it's like comparing apples and oranges. It's totally different. These upland areas have totally different species than what you're going to find in a marsh. But the diversity of the habitat in the Meadowlands really impacts birds because they can move around and locate newly developing habitats. So in the picture here is an interesting introduced species, the monk parakeets. They're communal nesters, and you can see them in Ridgewood and some of the other towns around the Meadowlands, nesting on people-built structures, porches, bridges, things like that, power lines and poles. And then we have a picture here of an American kestrel, not taken in the Meadowlands, but there's actually a pretty big population in the Meadowlands of them and a lot of other raptors, because raptors a lot of them like to hunt in those open areas, including Phragmites marshes. And so they benefit. But there is an issue for the American kestrel because they like to perch on small trees or shrubs. And in some of the landfills, the methane pipes that come out of the landfill are one of the places they like to perch. And when the methane, when they blow, when they burn off the gas, they get scorched. So that's actually an issue for them. So sometimes urban places they're attractive. Some of these animals want to go there, but when they're there, they actually have, a higher mortality because of issues like that. So knowing about that, though, maybe we can address it and make it safer for them. And then mammals. Here's a picture of the river otter. We did not see the otter, but we saw the otter sign. So a lot of the times you don't see mammals. Like, you have to go out and look for their prints or their scat. But here we have a picture of otter sign. You can see the footprints, very clearly otter. You can see the slide going down into the water. They like to play and slide around, and that was something. This is actually a picture Eric Kiviat took. And then American mink, they're in the Meadowlands as well. So species you would think would have a hard time surviving there, and there probably aren't very many, but they're there. Larger mammals, especially ones that roam a lot, like bears and bobcats, even, well, fox are there. Fox do well in urban settings, but they might get hit by cars a lot. But the larger mammals tend to have a harder time in urban areas because of mortality, road mortality especially. So I'm going to do a time check here, because for some reason I don't have a clock on my. Oh, 7? Okay. So I'm going to go really fast now. All right. So I know I kind of breezed over a lot of things, and the book is, you can look at that, the lists of species if you're interested in learning more in the book. And I think that we may even be publishing the lists of species on the Hudsonia website. But I really wanted to quickly talk about a place that we have our eye on right now. There's a lot of focus on the Upper Pinhorn Marsh in the northeastern part of the Meadowlands. And I'm going to quickly talk about why we're focused on this urban freshwater peatland. So like we said before, you often just see that the big radio towers are there in the Upper Pinhorn Marsh. We see this Phragmites when we see the Meadowlands. It's hard to look beyond it, right? But when you're on the ground and you peel it back, sometimes you find things that are surprising and also delightful. So we were doing a survey. I actually got to be there that day. This was maybe 10 years ago or so. And we were in Upper Pinhorn Marsh and looking around, and we were finding some cool things. And then nothing so, groundbreaking, but all of a sudden we just peeled back the Phragmites, looked in, and saw that there was actually a lot of sphagnum moss growing underneath the Phragmites in pretty large areas. So sphagnum is pretty sensitive. It's sensitive to contaminants, sensitive to drying down. So that was a sign that that's a remnant population, most likely, that's been able to persist in this large wetland that had, not been discovered yet. So this is a rough map of it. It hasn't really fully been mapped out. This green area here and over here is actually the area that has that special habitat that hadn't been detected before. So Upper Pinhorn Marsh is about 209 acres, protected by a tide gate. That's why it's fresh water. It has a lot of stormwater coming in from Sea Caucasus. Has a lot of, it's kind of isolated. It's got the turnpike. It's got the Amtrak embankment. A lot of Phragmites. But then we've got these interesting patches, and as I'm going to show you, we found some really interesting species there. There's even Atlantic white cedar stumps in there, and supports rare wildlife and plants. And this is thanks to the work of Eric Kiviat, Hudsonia, because we wouldn't have known about this. We might have said, hey, that's private. A lot of it's still private, and let them do what they want with it. Greasewort, Sharp's greasewort, small red peat moss, a couple other peat mosses in there. Floating marsh pennywort, which is a very globally rare species. Atlantic coast leopard frog, least bittern, Virginia rail, barn owls, and muskrat, which, believe it or not, muskrat is kind of like the flagship mammal of the Meadowlands, but they're actually declining. And that's something that we're seeing a phenomenon of in other areas in the United States. So I'm not going to go into too much, but here's floating marsh pennywort. It's endangered. There's several populations in the Meadowlands. So that's something that was one of our special finds during our work. So we made some recommendations. We're working with the Army Corps of Engineers because they're thinking of putting a wetland mitigation bank in this site to take out Phragmites and try to restore some of the areas there. But we feel we need more surveys, and we need to study that entire marsh complex. It's 200 acres, so that's a big area that needs to be surveyed for lots of different things, not just plants. And then there's like the elephant in the room, the Phragmites. So we do have to kind of really consider the ecosystem services of the Phragmites in the Meadowlands, given the urban context and the history. It does stabilize and build the soils. It sequesters and stores carbon in phytomass and peat. It improves water quality. It's able to store heavy metals and other chemical contaminants and keep it not available to other organisms and biologically available. It's also protecting the sphagnum that we just talked about in that site from excess nutrients, and reduces hydrodynamic energy. So when there's flooding, the water hits the Phragmites and slows down, so it has an impact on the hydrology of the area. And as we just showed, it supports biodiversity. It's self-maintaining. You don't have to spend a lot of money to go back and herbicide the area and mow it and do things to it. So those are just some things about Phragmites we do need to consider. But predominant habitat management is to kill the Phragmites, the non-native species, with or without removal of the Phragmites and the recontouring of the soil surface. Plant spartina, cordgrass, and in some cases build islands because they're actually good wildlife habitat. And in this picture here, there's someone spraying the Phragmites reinvasion because that's the problem. It requires several years of continually going out there to prevent the reinvasion of Phragmites. So some of the pros are, yes, it replaces the non-native with native plants, creates mudflats. A lot of shorebirds forage on the mudflats. You get some valuable volunteer species coming in of plants like tidewater hemp, dwarf spike rush, salt marsh fleabane. Some of the cons are, like we said, perpetual maintenance, potentially a net loss of wetland, especially if it's a mitigation bank and you've destroyed another wetland to put money in to mitigate this wetland in the Meadowlands. Herbicide can be toxic to non-target organisms, and there's a lot of other issues associated with it. And the carbon sequestration is one of those issues. So if Phragmites is sequestering carbon and is successful, we do need to take that into account with the current climate change issues that we're dealing with and trying to address. So some of the messages in the book are, don't try to increase the abundance of urban sensitive groups that aren't there or in very small numbers unless you're going to try to deal with the reasons they're not there first. And fix those things. And then don't try to recreate the countryside in the city necessarily. You kind of have to take into account the urban context that you're in and the history of the area and what's going to actually be successful. So do survey. These are the positives. Do survey, conserve, and manage what's there. Do learn to manage Phragmites to optimize its functions. Do work on amelioration of poor water quality. That's still very much in need in the Meadowlands, and some of you may have heard that the Hackensack River is up for listing as a Superfund site because of the contaminants in the sediments. Do experiment selectively with reestablishment of native species that were formerly present in the area. We can do a lot for small organisms. We can provide more nectar and pollen resources. We can provide thickets and shelters for nesting and food for songbirds and invertebrates. We can protect those small pools, figure out a way to do it. If you're not going to let the dirt bikes come in, we still need pools like that if we're going to keep that species there. Stumps, logs, and rocks for mosses, lichen, and fungi, and bare soil for burrowing bees and wasps. Now, I'm going to kind of take a little sidetrack here quickly to talk about what I do now, which is in my conservation life. I work for Raritan Headwaters, and a lot of what we do as science director, we actually monitor water quality so that we can help to inform areas that need to be restored if they have poor water quality, and areas that need to be protected if they have good water quality, and potentially forest and ecosystems that support good water quality. One of the things we do is we like to make sure everybody knows they all play a part. Everybody has a part to play. We use the River Friendly program as our outreach platform to engage and educate people in what they can do on their own property. So the resident program is actually focused on all of us. You know, we're all having an impact on water quality. We're all having an impact on pollinators by what we're doing on our own property. So you can do things to try to use less herbicides, insecticides, conserve water, plant native plants, install a rain garden, and actually New Jersey Friendly Yards is a program that we promote through our River Friendly program as well. And then there's even more kind of strict programs that require lots of requirements for schools, golf courses, businesses, and farms to be certified as river friendly. So that's a great program. Green infrastructure, really important. We've already done things to the city. We've already created all this pavement. So now we kind of have to figure out how we can go back and fix it so that it functions better. And this is where we try to install natural systems or better options for pavement to capture stormwater and prevent it from running off and going right into our rivers and streams. We also want to restore ecological connectivity. So we've been working on one project to map the culverts and bridges to see, are they providing aquatic connectivity under roadways? Are terrestrial animals able to cross back and forth under the roadway using these culverts and under other types of structures? Another thing we're working on is dam removals. So restoring the natural flow of water, and also the ability for fish to go upstream and downstream. There's a lot of migratory fish that need to be moving back and forth from freshwater to marine systems. And then all of us play a role in kind of documenting what's out there. And I'm sure many of you already do this. Maybe iNaturalist or another app to be collecting information on biodiversity. So, you know, I like iNaturalist, but there's probably other ones. And the information is a citizen science project you're contributing to on biodiversity that we might otherwise not know about. How many of you are using iNaturalist or a similar? Okay, so it's really popular. I love it too because sometimes I can't identify something and it at least gives me a clue of what it is. And also want to talk about climate change and the Meadowlands. So we've got storm surge control coming, dikes, levees, tide gates, all of those infrastructure plans that are coming out for the Meadowlands are, you know, potentially some of them might be a good idea. Some of them might just be a Band-Aid on a bigger problem. Because if we put up tide gates, we might end up trapping polluted stormwater inside the tide gate and thereby impacting whatever's upstream of the tide gate. It's also going to be impacting movement of fish and other aquatic organisms. And it's taking the place of what we really should be talking about is the reality of climate change, the reality of big storms and storm surge and sea level rise in these low-lying urban areas. There's the idea of managed retreat, where we move the property out of there and allow those habitats like salt marshes to have a place to retreat as sea level rises. The Blue Acres program, purchasing land from homeowners and businesses so that they're not right in the path of all this water. And so I'm gonna leave it at that. But there are some big plans out there. There's a current feasibility study that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers for the entire harbor estuary that you might want to check out. I'm gonna skip over that. I'm almost done with time. There's lots we learned, you know, and I could go down the list and repeat everything again, but I'm not going to. So we did learn a lot. We did learn that the New Jersey Meadowlands is a gem of biodiversity in an urban setting. We're lucky to still have that biodiversity there, in large part because of the wetlands, you know, made it harder to develop those areas a long time ago. And now we get to have all the biodiversity there. It's just that what are we going to do with that? What kind of decisions are we going to make? And how are we going to learn to keep it there and possibly even improve biodiversity in the Meadowlands? Lots of acknowledgments, including the Native Plant Society of New Jersey. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I know Eric is very appreciative as well. And, you know, it was just so nice that you did that. And we're interested in hearing about the Meadowlands. If you have any questions, I will be here all day, and I'm going to be outside. I have a table set up with a display copy of the book. I also have flyers for the 30% discount, or you could just take a picture of the flyer taped to the table. Don't buy the book at full cost. It's one of those expensive books because there aren't that many printed. So if you want the book, definitely take the flyer or take a picture of the flyer. With that, I'm going to hand it over to the audience. Thank you.
So we're actually going to have our mic runners handle the field of questions, and also Bobby from Zoom, right? Am I correct on that? Okay. So if there are questions of the audience, raise your hands. Otherwise, are people dying up to hear?
So while we're waiting for the live audience to get their questions together, we have quite a few on Zoom. One set of questions are about the surveys, Christy. Like, how frequently does that vary by each type of plant, animal, etc.? And does it change faster than you can resurvey?
Good questions. It very much varies by the specific organisms. So, for instance, if you want to survey mammals, it's extremely, especially small mammals like rodents and shrews and moles. It's very intensive. You need to be trapping most of the time, trapping at night. Have lots of traps out there, and you know it's intensive in that way. Some other surveys are more just observational, where you're walking transects and just seeing what's there. A lot of bird surveys could be like that, or point count surveys. Butterfly surveys are like that. And then plant surveys are just covering lots of area, especially to detect the rare species. You're definitely going to miss things if you're not looking around, and you know, if it's 200-acre area, that's a lot of area to look in. Sometimes it's hard to get through that area walking. Things do change. So, for instance, that Phragmites blue joint grass area that I showed you is supposedly not there anymore. And even some of the pools along the pipeline road that I showed you for the clam shrimp, when they were restoring some areas of the Cane Natural Area, they repaved the road and those pools were gone. So there's little accidents that happen, you know, for biodiversity. Also, ecosystems change. So plant communities are developing and changing over time. So the species that are there are going to change. And then we have climate change as well. So we've got changes happening in, you know, where the southern species are going to be moving further north, and the northern species retreating further north. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of changes. So yes, this is something that has to be continual. We need to be out there surveying as much as we can. So luckily, there's a lot of preserved areas in the Meadowlands to visit, and you can, you know, go out there, like I said, and be a botanist doing surveys or other, you know, report other biodiversity that you see. What I was going to show you this. Someone might ask this question, but this book is free, and it's a little outdated at this point, but the Meadowlands is an intimidating place to just go to for some people. If you're not from that area, and to just find these parks in the middle of all these highways. This book is Birding and Wildlife Trails, Meadowlands and More. This is from New Jersey Audubon, Hackensack Riverkeeper, and the New Jersey Meadowlands Commission. They actually have a website for this. So it's New Jersey Birding and Wildlife Trails. They have several of these books for different places. And it shows you, and there's maps, there's directions, there's little tidbits about where to park and what you'll see there. So I highly recommend this. They now have an online version of this that's probably updated more frequently. So I highly recommend, getting this type of thing to help you navigate an urban area and how to find those natural places there.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if the Environmental Education Center in the Meadowlands gets involved with any of this kind of research.
Oh, yes, they certainly do. We've worked with some of the biologists there, Brett Bragan, Artigas, I'm forgetting his first name right now, but, Francisco, sorry. Francisco Artigas. Yes, we have, there's research being done by the Meadowlands Commission. There's a research institute there. And in the early parts of our days accumulating all this information in the late 90s, and for the last 23 years, we have worked a lot with them. We request information. Some of the naturalists who work there are treasure troves of information because they're on the ground looking around all the time. They take people on tours. So yes, we do. We work with them and have utmost respect for them.
So we had a couple questions on the Atlantic white cedars. Is it possible to replant them, or is that habitat just lethal to them now?
Oh, there are efforts to plant Atlantic white cedars in areas that I know of away from the Meadowlands. They need the freshwater areas and they need high water quality. And there is potential to restore them in some places in the Meadowlands. I'm just not aware if there are projects going on right now. There are projects going on at Sherman Hoffman in Bernardsville, New Jersey, which is a nature preserve owned by New Jersey Audubon. They're planting some white cedars. And so, yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer that, whether they're doing it, but large-scale restoration of Atlantic white cedar forests is probably not going to happen, and not the best plan, especially since we know that we've got that salinity and a lot of other issues with sea level rise occurring.
Regarding the Phragmites, have there been any studies to show whether it has more or less biodiversity than native plants? You said there were a lot of pros to it.
Yeah, there actually have. So a lot of people do compare having, a monoculture of Phragmites with having, a much more diverse, salt marsh habitat or freshwater marsh. And often there's more diversity in those more diverse habitats, okay? But we also find that not all Phragmites is the same. So like we showed before, there's Phragmites where you've got other native or non-native plants interspersed with them. And they're not just all Phragmites monocultures. So there's room to kind of explore that as potential for, having high biodiversity. But I don't think anybody's really compared that for anything other than looking at plants. But whether birds benefit more by having a more diverse Phragmites patch, as opposed to salt marsh or another type of habitat. I don't know if that's been done. But I will say Phragmites and a monoculture of Phragmites is not going to be an area of the highest biodiversity. It's just that it has other values potentially in an urban ecosystem.
Christy, one thing I'd like to point out is that if you can get a ticket to the Hackensack Riverkeeper boat tour, it's incredible. It's a 2-hour boat tour all around the Meadowlands. It's beautiful.
I highly recommend it.
We can give everyone give a big hand to Christy again for coming.
Thank you.